This is one of those fun kind of threads that comes across your desk every so often that once you start pulling it, you're not sure how far down the rabbit hole you can go. But it's something that's certainly been fun to think about. Archaeology doesn't usually study stuff like baseball. So despite being America's pastime since the Civil War, archaeologists have really not contributed to our understanding of baseball. And it's probably not a surprise given that that despite the large footprint that baseball diamonds have, you don't really need any permanent infrastructure to play the game, and any material culture that you have, it's not going to be thrown away like most archaeological debris, and it's not going to preserve the same way that ceramic and glass does. So archaeologists at the city of Alexandria have identified more than almost 30 baseball fields, not from archaeological remains, but by using early 20th century aerial photographs. Sanborn maps, oral histories. So in this paper, we survey the existing archaeology as it relates to baseball. We look at baseball through the lens of landscape archaeology, and we use some of the tools of GIS to locate and classify some baseball-related features that we found in the city. So there's no shortage of historical research. If a quick glance on Amazon shows hundreds and hundreds and thousands of books dedicated to players and teams and leagues and pennant races and seasons and stadiums, managers, equipment, all these things. Fenway Park, home of the Red Sox, and the Astrodome, the former home of the Houston Astros, are both listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And Wrigley Field has been declared eligible for the National Historic Landmark designation, but hasn't been listed by its owner. And then on the register are also several minor league stadiums used for spring training, and several other playing facilities like the field in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, the birth of the Little League. There's sort of a patina of history, memory, and nostalgia that surrounds the game of baseball. And despite the attention given to the history of the game, archaeologists have contributed very, very little to this. So as a field, if it can be called that, baseball archaeology, the archaeology related to baseball, has some potential, but at the moment can be hardly said to exist. The most common form of baseball archaeology seems to be archaeology conducted in advance of baseball-related construction. So given the amount of public money and the impacts and the complex permitting processes necessary to construct modern ballparks, usually some kind of environmental, historical, architectural, or archaeological survey is required prior to construction. So locally, kind of broadly, the archaeological work conducted by R. Christopher Goodwin and Associates in the early 90s prior to the construction of Camden Yards in Baltimore, or that the work that's been called as part of redevelopment plans at Shockoe Bottom in Richmond are two examples of how baseball can drive very visible archaeological research in the present. However, compliance work conducted on future baseball sites isn't exactly an archaeology that addresses baseball in the past. The excavations at Oriole Park are also illustrative in another sense, another kind of baseball archaeology. During the course of their research, archaeologists located and excavated the remains of a saloon operated by George Herman Ruth Sr., Babe Ruth's father, located under the Orioles' future center field. This second kind of baseball archaeology, the archaeology related to specific individuals attached to the game, is less common than the first. And because of the difficulty of locating specific individuals in the archaeological record, archaeology isn't generally the appropriate tool for researching homes and birthplaces of early baseball players and officials. In rare cases, archaeologists have uncovered archaeological remains specifically related to baseball. For example, here in Kitchener, Ontario, the city was putting in new bathrooms for their park when construction crews located the remains of a former grandstand and other components to the baseball stadium. So as is in the case of the Ruth Saloon, archaeological discovery was not a targeted investigation, but was the result of new construction and historical happenstance. So while archaeologists generally haven't seriously undertaken a research program dedicated to the archaeology of baseball, and probably for good reasons, the tools and techniques that are familiar to archaeologists have been employed for vaguely archaeological purposes. So in Baltimore, we keep coming back to Baltimore, surveyors have relocated Old Oriole Park, which was previously Terrapin Baseball Park, based not on excavations and digging, but on surviving maps and blueprints. And this activity should be familiar to any archaeologist with a total station or a transit who's had to reestablish a site grid or relocate lost test units from a previous field season. A common occurrence when team moves from one stadium to another is a ceremonial excavation of home plate from the old stadium to the new one. Similarly, many stadiums, after they've been demolished, memorialize the location of their former home plates in the form of a marker or a plaque in the ground, most often shaped like a home plate. In Baltimore, many pieces of the Orioles' previous home, Memorial Stadium, have been taken apart and moved to their new home at Camden Yards. And as an Oriole fan, it pains me particularly to say this, but even the Yankees have incorporated many design elements from old Yankee Stadium to new Yankee Stadium. So while these activities aren't anthropological archaeology as we generally practice it, we can view these cultural activities as being in the same ballpark, if you pardon my use of the phrase, as they all involve the recordation, the recovery, and the preservation of history, heritage, and memory. So while archaeologists haven't addressed 19th and 20th century baseball-related resources, such a project isn't really without precedent. Elsewhere, archaeologists have successfully documented Mesoamerican ball courts and Greek and Roman sports complexes. And not only have they identified and recorded these features, but many have approached them anthropologically in an attempt to understand the cultural processes sort of surrounding the use, creation of these sites, ranging from anything from political complexity to cosmological worldview. So this being said, the most significant hurdle to overcome to creating an archaeology of baseball is the small technical problem of identifying an archaeological resource that doesn't need to consist much more of dirt and maybe a little bit of grass. So like I said earlier, most baseball equipment won't survive in the archaeological record. And if it did, bases and balls and gloves and bats aren't the kind of things that are generally discarded and left lying in a field for archaeologists to find. So archaeologically, finding playing fields and baseball-related artifacts presents a much more difficult task for the archaeologist. Going through the catalog of Alexandria archaeology, which spans 50 years of excavation, we've been able to identify exactly one artifact that may or may not be related to baseball. This ball was recovered from a well on the 300 block of King Street, just across from City Hall and Market Square in Alexandria and Old Town. It's about 2 inches in diameter and comprised of wrapped leather strips or straps or cord of varying thicknesses. A call to Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame. I learned that early baseballs were notoriously unstandardized. And generally made by cobblers, tanners, or other craftsmen who have leather scraps lying around. So if you needed a baseball, you would walk down the street to your tanner and ask him to put you something together. So on this block in the mid-19th century, historical research has uncovered a cobbler's shop, somebody who would have extra leather lying around if we wanted a ball made. Baseball, it's generally considered a northern game from urban areas like New York City until well after the Civil War. So it's difficult to say whether or not this is a baseball or even a ball for sports playing similar games that were popular at the time, but it's certainly tempting. In this 1861 photograph taken from Shooter's Hill, probably 200 yards from the Masonic Memorial in Old Town, is the camp of the 44th New York Regiment, camped at the head of King Street. And if you look really closely, we can see here in the photograph the earliest baseball field in the city. So if you look closely, here's your diamond. So traditional archaeological approaches that consist of digging and looking for physical remains are largely inadequate for finding something as ephemeral as this. So in order to proceed, I suggest we employ some of the tools and techniques from landscape archaeology to help us out. Developed in part largely by archaeologists from places like Mount Vernon and Monticello to research large mostly empty archaeological spaces like gardens or plantation landscapes. Landscape archaeology has grown as a field to help archaeologists understand sort of these large or ephemeral archaeological sites that have relatively little material culture to help us define them. So armed with tools like historic aerial photographs, historic maps, and oral histories, we can start to identify some of these baseball resources in the city. So one of the first things that we turned to were the Sanborn fire insurance maps, which we have to document 150 50 years of the city. So on exactly 3 of them, we see anything that is remotely like a baseball field. The first one from 1921, it's labeled baseball grounds, and if you look, we have a grandstand, and diamond, and actually I saw this the other day for the red person, you can see that they're playing football on this field as well. We also have, in 1921, an athletic field located just north of Jones Point, north of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. And then in 1941, we see an athletic field appear at the Episcopal High School. So on the left, we have the Sanborn maps. On the right, if you look, we have historic aerial imagery of the same places. And if we're trying to identify baseball resources, these historic aerial images are actually a much better resource for us to find them. So aerial photography is sort of the culmination of 2 maturing technologies in the early 20th century, power flight and portable film photography. And early aerial surveys like this one represent a powerful tool for documenting much of the United States prior to the explosive growth after World War II. As a planning and preservation tool, the city of Alexandria has acquired and stitched together a series of historic aerial images covering the modern extent of the city. Taken in 1927 by the U.S. Army Air Corps for the National Capital Planning Commission. They are 7-inch by 9-inch large format aerial photographs that are currently held by the National Archives in College Park. So precedent of using this kind of tool to find baseball resources isn't entirely without precedent. Again, coming back to Baltimore, a university professor in Delaware, Bernard McKenna, has used this aerial photography also from 1927 to find 6 stadiums that have sort of disappeared from the present landscape. And if we look at this photograph, there's actually 2 of the ones he found. The one at the top right is Old Memorial Stadium or Municipal Stadium. And the one at the center left is Terrapin Park or Old Oriole Park. So Old Oriole Park and Old Memorial Stadium. So while what he's been able to find are sort of these large public gathering spaces, one of the things that he hasn't addressed are the much smaller fields that people like you or I or children on the street, they'd be playing in. So in this photograph, there are no less than 13 others, much smaller, usually consisting of worn out spots in the grass. So taking this back to Alexandria, we can comb through the historic aerial images that we have and identify the same kind of resources. These small, relatively ephemeral, worn out spots in the grass where people are playing baseball. And we have, I think the last time I counted, 31 of them. So because we're archaeologists and we like classifying things, we were able to put together a typology of these baseball fields. So we actually had a lot of fun doing this too. So type 1, baseball grounds. These are sort of your large public facilities. There's grandstands, scoreboards. This is somewhere you would come and have to pay money to watch people play professionally. This one is located next to the King Street Metro. Type 2 ball fields, there's exactly one of these in the city. It's a very well manicured field. This one is at the Episcopal High School. Type 3, we start to get a little less permanent. They're defined primarily by worn out base paths. You can see bases, pitcher's mounds, and there's usually a line connecting the pitcher's mound to home plate. Type 4 are much more ephemeral, and frequently all you have are worn out bases from people standing around waiting for the pitcher to throw the ball, I guess. And sometimes there's a faint base path, but the bases themselves are sort of the primary feature of these. And then type 5, which is just a grassy field, and archaeologically, in these historical photographs, we don't actually see any of these because they're indistinguishable from any other grass. But surely people are playing baseball in spots like this. So that's sort of the range, the spectrum of what we see on the aerial photographs. So one of the other resources that we have are these oral histories. And going through some of the oral histories that have been conducted for other projects through Alexandria Archaeology, we've actually come across some references to the ball fields that we've seen in our historic maps, our aerial photographs. So this interview was conducted with Milton Penn, the former fire chief of Alexandria, and he told us that behind that, some of these houses, they had a ball field. There was a gradual slope toward the west, and they had a dugout there. And this is actually relevant to us because we, and I say we like I've been there, but since 1995, Alexandria Archaeology has been digging up at this site, and I don't know that we knew that, aside from this little reference, that that ball field was there. So as frequently seems to be the case with many other aspects of archaeology, finding a resource, once you know what you're looking for, is kind of the easy part. And considering what to do with them now that you know where they are is a much more difficult, a much more thorny problem. So none of the fields that we identified in our survey exist into the present. Only a few of them have not been built over by residential development or an expanding urban core. Given the ephemeral and improvised nature of these fields, it's not really a surprise that there was no major objection to their replacement with whatever they were replaced with. And as such, even if they are identifiable using traditional trowel and dirt archaeology, most probably no longer exist, even archaeologically. The other significant problem is that they take up a lot of space. Just the infield contained within the base paths of a 90-foot by 90-foot diamond sits on about 1/5 of an acre. And once you account for the rest of the infield, the outfield, foul territory, and whatever other part of a baseball field you want to consider, we're looking at 2 or more acres. Convincing a developer or a property owner to set aside this amount of land to interpret a 1920s baseball field seems like it's a hard sell. So given those limitations, how might a department tasked with preserving and studying Alexandria's rich archaeological heritage and fostering within residents and visitors a connection between the past and present while inspiring a sense of stewardship and adventure go about dealing with these resources? So here's just 3 quick case studies, I guess. The image you see on the left is Baggett's Field. That's the sort of the official stadium in town, located just at the end of Old Town next to the Metro. And in being the largest field, the most permanent field in the city, it's would seem to be the most obvious candidate for some kind of historical interpretation. It didn't exist much past World War II when it was replaced by a car dealership. And now, as you can see, it's been built over pretty heavily, and that's a hotel that sits there now. So if baseball archaeology is even something worth thinking about, this would be a wonderful site to apply it to, but I don't know that that opportunity exists. So 2 other candidates that might bear mentioning are these 2 here. The one in the center is located just across King Street from Baggett's Field, literally under the steps of the Metro. And the other one is up on Shooters Hill behind the George Washington Masonic Memorial. So this one in the center here by the King Street Metro is surprisingly close to the location of the one seen in the historic photograph of the 44th New York. And the highly visible location and sort of publicly accessible component to the site makes it a relatively good candidate for, on the ground, some kind of memorialization, if similar to, marking out the location of the base paths in a historic interpretive sign. The second field on Shooters Hill is unique among the resources that we've identified in that it's the only one that hasn't been built over by something. The Masons have owned the property since the early 20th century and have maintained this park-like atmosphere and have been instrumental in the preservation of this site, as well as the 2 plantation mansions, Civil War fort, golf course, and whatever else is up there that we've spent 20 years excavating. So given the lack of disturbance here, if these baseball resources are identifiable archaeologically, this is the place where we're going to find it. And actually, yesterday before I left the office, I got the results of a geophysical survey, and it's not something that you would point out and say that's a baseball feature, but there certainly are 4 anomalies in each of the corners of our field there. So it's actually kind of exciting to look at and think that maybe they still exist in some form. So at Alexandria Archaeology, our mission statement tasks us to foster within residents a connection between the past and present and inspire a sense of stewardship and adventure. And finding archaeological resources like baseball fields, it's not something that's high on the list of anybody's priorities of things to save, but I think if you're trying to inspire a sense of adventure, maybe a resource like this is a pretty good place to start. So while they may not exist in the present and may be incredibly difficult to find archaeologically, using georeferenced aerial photographs that we have from the early 20th century provides a unique glimpse at this class of historic resources that have generally been ignored. So now that we know where to find them and how to find them, these early resources present a new challenge for us. Thank you.
I was just kind of curious. You found, I guess, the last field that you found on the back of Shearers Hill. Are there any plans or thoughts to try to do any kind of excavation either around the base sites or the dugouts?
Well, so the reason we did the geophysical survey in the first place is we're trying to find the 18th century mansion that's up there. We have an outbuilding that we found underneath of the 19th century plantation we've been digging. And we know from fire insurance policies that there's at least one matched outbuilding that we don't quite know where it is, and then the mansion that goes with it. So we were doing the survey in an attempt to find those 2 things. And actually, when you sort of look at where, how the buildings are arranged and how far these other buildings might be, the reason that this baseball field is placed here in the first place might be because that when the other outbuilding came down, there was a small little mound where you have the remains of a building, which makes a pretty good pitcher's mound. So I wouldn't be terribly surprised if we move over there and start digging and find this other outbuilding that it's directly on top of where this pitcher's mound is going to be.
I was just curious. It's an interesting topic. What got you into baseball archaeology?
It was one of those aha moments, and I was sitting here today and I realized I don't have the image of it, but the one on the right here, we've been digging up at Shearers Hill since '95, and we have the aerial photograph, and I've been staring at this thing trying to make sense of what we see in 1927, and I know that the USGS had a 100-foot tall tower out there for sighting things, and there's this. I mean, it looks kind of like this thing here. There's just 4 dots in a diamond, and I was staring at it, and I couldn't quite figure out what this thing was until I was on the Library of Congress looking for something else, and they had it was probably this image of the base paths, and it was sort of highlighted.